Walter Almeida says, or asks rather, what do you think will be the next biggest innovation in flight? Wow. Um, you know, it's heartbreaking in one way, I suppose. No, not just in one way. In one way, and that is continuously, to watch how little actual progress we make in aviation. You know, the Wright brothers flew in 1903, and the world's fastest airplane, the SR-71, I want to say first flew in 63. It might have been 66, but it was mid-60s. So 60 years to go from no flying to 3 times the speed of sound, and then, you know, virtually another 60 years to essentially do nothing. The 707 I flew in as a boy. My first airplane ride was in a Boeing 707, Pan Am Boeing 707. I was 3 years old. And that plane is not any faster, or slower rather, than the planes I fly today 50 years later, 52 years later. The aircraft are still moving at 520, 530, 540 miles an hour. The 707 was such a breakthrough aircraft that it was such a breakthrough aircraft that it's hard to imagine there was a time before the 707. The Comet, the de Havilland Comet, the British airliner, preceded the 707 by a couple years in service, but it wasn't. There was so much about that airplane that is not modern by our standards, and one of the things that's not modern about the de Havilland Comet, for those of you that don't know the story, is the Comet had square windows. Why is that important? Why do airplanes have round windows? And why did the Comet have square windows? And why does that matter? Well, it matters because on old airplanes, when you would just fly in the weather, square windows easy to cut. Round is generally harder. In practice, however, when you started getting a pressurized cabin, every time you pressurize the cabin, you're expanding that cabin and putting pressure on the inside of this tube. And engineers will tell you that whenever you have a right angle, that's called a stress riser. That's where the forces are at their strongest, right at the angle there. And so the de Havilland Comet, with its square windows, after they had the thing in service for months or years, basically disappeared. One of them just broke up in flight, and then another one did. They just disintegrated. And needless to say, that put a bit of a stress on de Havilland, and I suppose it was BOAC at the time. My mom worked for BOAC, a British Overseas Airways Corporation, which became British Air. So they were flying the Comets. They didn't know what happened. They couldn't figure it out. They just knew these planes were just basically coming apart in the air. And so what they did was they built a gigantic water tank, and using the water, they could increase the load on the airframe over what they could do with air. So basically they had to cycle one of the new airframes, and they didn't have time to cycle it through regular pressure, so they increased the pressure with water. And what they found was that as they started to run these cycles of pressurization, depressurization, cracks started to appear on all the corners of the windows. And so basically, both of these Comets were just flying along, and they just basically, when one of them came loose, the whole thing came loose, and they just disintegrated in midair. But even then, the Comet does not look like a modern jet. It's got, the engines are right up against the wings, built into the wings. The tail doesn't look particularly modern. There's not a whole lot of sweep on the wings. But you look at a Boeing 707, and it's got all the features. You got this nice sweep on the wings. You got that kind of iconic Boeing nose. You've got engines and nacelles under the wings, and you got the round windows. And man, that is a beautiful, beautiful airplane. We're still flying them as tankers. The KC-135 and the J-Stars and the AWACS are all based on 707 airframes. They're 707s. And that spike on the tail is the only airplane ever had that little pitot tube spike on the tail. That's absolutely fantastic little touch. Anyway, so there hasn't been any big innovations in flight in the last 50 years. It's just been refinements. You've still basically got the Boeing 707, either with 2 engines like the 737 or 4 like a 747 or A360 or something like that. But they've gotten incrementally more efficient, incrementally better. The navigation and avionics are infinitely better. Their reliability is better, their maintenance is better, all that stuff. But nothing innovative, nothing breathtaking. So I would say, Walter, there's probably, if I had to guess, I would say the next big innovation that I would be looking at are either, I was going to say the supercritical wings, which are really efficient, but we tried those for a while back, 20 years ago, and didn't get much out of those. I think it might be this idea that you can design an airplane design the actual fuselage in such a way that it doesn't create anything like the kind of sonic booms. It's a very low impact supersonic airframe, and they do it in a series of clever ways. The reason, by the way, you hear the double boom. I was out at Edwards Air Force Base when I was flying gliders in '93, and we went just out. I mean, it was 20 miles away to watch a shuttle landing, and everybody's looking up there trying to find it. We're looking out on the horizon. We're trying to find this thing, and all of a sudden, it was like somebody fired my .45, like right behind my ear. I mean, it was, you're so used to, in movies you hear the sonic booms kind of far away. Things like, no, this was like bam, bam, like that. It's like, holy cow. And everybody's looking straight up, and right over our head was this dart of the shuttle. But it's bam, bam. It's a two booms, and it's because the nose and the leading edge of the nose is creating one, and the leading edge of the vertical stabilizer is creating a second one. So they're basically talking about a design that can smooth all this stuff out. And the reason I think that could be the next innovation in flight, Walter, is if they can figure out how to make supersonic flight without the boom, or with a much, much reduced boom, then you can start talking about going from LA to New York in under an hour. And while that never paid off in the Concorde, see below, I think you probably find a market for it here in America. There's a lot of traffic between New York and LA. And if they could basically, instead of having to make this thing look like the Concorde and have that much power, if they could figure out a way to do it and keep it subsonic, keep the sound down, you might have a case. The Concorde, which I'll talk about in a minute, all supersonic transports were killed by the fact that they could not fly supersonic over the United States of America, where half or three-quarters of the world's air traffic is or used to be. So we'll come back to that when we get to the Concorde. So I'm hoping, Walter, to answer your question, the next big innovation will be low-impact supersonic flight. I don't see anything really innovative in engines out there. Everything just seems to be kind of an evolution, increasing efficiencies. The wings are getting better, the engines are getting better, the maintenance is getting better, but there's nothing out there that looks like, wow. If you can get the boom down, I'd say there's one other possibility, and that would be kind of this suborbital sort of scramjet kind of thing. We're making some progress with these supersonic ramjets, about the simplest machine there is. It's basically just a chamber, and you fly this thing through the air at the speed of sound and higher, and that air gets compressed in the chamber. You squirt some fuel in there, off you go. So scramjet, if that could get you into a suborbital flight, if you can get into outer space, there's no part of the Earth that's anything further than 45 minutes away. If you can get up there, Australia's 45 minutes away. And it's just hard to imagine that being able to pay off economically unless you had a really big airframe, but you never know. So the sad thing is, to answer your question, Walter, I don't see anything in terms of big innovations in flight. I'm sorry to say. And that's a little depressing in its own way, but I guess on another way it's a sign that we really made real progress, and we continue to make progress. Sometimes you hammer all the nails down early, and then, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And then you're just left with, sanding and finishing and filing. That's what it seems like.